Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Hillbilly Elegy 2020, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. In the quiet, winding roads of rural Ohio and the faded corners of Kentucky's Appalachian valleys, a story unfolds that isn't loud or sensational, but deeply human. Hillbilly Elegy, directed by Ron Howard and based on the best-selling memoir by J.D. Vance, dives into the raw, complex fabric of a working-class American family grappling with love, trauma, addiction, and identity. It's a film that doesn't paint its characters with the bright colors of heroism or villainy, but instead explores the murky in-between, where resilience and pain often live side by side. This isn't a movie that relies on car chases or sci-fi showdowns. Instead, it leans into something arguably more intense, the reality of familial bonds strained by generations of hardship. At its core, Hillbilly Elegy is the story of a young man caught between two worlds, his troubled upbringing in a volatile home and his aspirations for a life beyond the limits of his inherited chaos. Through a powerful dual-timeline narrative, we're taken on a journey that's as much about personal growth as it is about the roots that refuse to let go. The film introduces us to J.D. Vance, a Yale law student with a promising future on the horizon. He wears a suit, talks the talk, and is just a handshake away from a prestigious internship. But when he gets a call from his sister Lindsay about their mother Bev's latest relapse, his carefully structured life is shattered. He's pulled back to the very world he's been trying to escape, a place of poverty, instability, and emotional landmines. The drive back home becomes the gateway into the past, and through J.D.'s eyes, we plunge into the memories that shaped him. As J.D. returns to his Ohio hometown, the film shifts between his present-day crisis and the flashbacks of his youth, where we meet a younger version of him, sensitive, observant, and forced to grow up too fast. We witness the chaos of life with his mother, Bev, played with haunting intensity by Amy Adams. Bev is brilliant, loving, and warm one moment, and unpredictable, destructive, and lost the next. Addiction wraps around her like a second skin, and her struggle isn't just chemical, it's generational. The film doesn't excuse her actions, but it doesn't condemn her either. It looks at her through J.D.'s conflicted lens, filled with both pain and compassion. Then there's Mama, the film's towering, unforgettable force. Played by the indomitable Glenn Close, Mama is a foul-mouthed, cigarette-smoking grandmother who might just be the most unexpected hero you'll ever meet. She's abrasive, unfiltered, and as tough as they come. But beneath her rough exterior lies a fierce love for her grandson and an unshakable determination to protect him from repeating the cycles of their family. Mama is the kind of character who steals every scene, not because she tries, but because her presence demands it. She is the heart and spine of the story, often the only adult J.D. can rely on when his world spirals into chaos. The film moves fluidly between timelines, allowing us to see how each childhood moment echoes into J.D.'s adult life. A fight in a hospital waiting room, a moment of panic over an unpaid bill, a dinner table confrontation. Each scene adds a piece to the puzzle of who J.D. is becoming. These aren't just flashbacks for context, they are keys that unlock his present-day decisions. As the tension mounts around his mother's condition, the weight of his past threatens to pull him under. Will he answer the call of duty and family, or will he preserve the future he's worked so hard to build? Hillbilly Elegy doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't simplify the very real complexities of poverty, addiction, or the stigma of being hillbilly in a world that often looks down on rural America. Instead, it presents its characters as they are, flawed, resilient, broken, and beautiful in their own raw way. And as J.D. struggles with his identity, caught between the polished halls of Yale and the rough truth of his roots, the film asks the audience to consider what it really means to come from somewhere. The story digs deep into the notion of legacy. J.D. doesn't just carry the burden of his mother's choices, he carries generations of struggle. His family is layered with contradictions. They're loving but volatile, supportive yet damaging. His journey is one of navigation, finding a way to honor the people who raised him while carving a path that looks nothing like theirs. It's a delicate dance between survival and self-definition. What makes the film so compelling are the small, intimate moments that feel too honest to be scripted. A child hiding in the back seat of a car during a violent argument. A boy begging his mother to stay clean, only to see her fall again. A grandmother sitting on a couch, teaching her grandson about respect while surrounded by the clutter of a home that has seen too much. These are the images that stay with you, not because they're loud, but because they're true. And yet, for all its heaviness, the film isn't devoid of hope. There's laughter, unexpected tenderness, and even a few moments of triumph. When young J.D. finds solace in his love for history, when Mama shows up at school to stand up for him, when adult J.D. finally faces his mother with honesty, these scenes radiate with the quiet strength that runs beneath the pain. The story never glamorizes hardship, but it also never dismisses the grit it takes to survive. As the film builds toward its emotional climax, J.D. must make a choice. His Yale interview looms, a dream job within reach. But his mother needs help. She's slipping again. And no one else is there. The final stretch of the film becomes less about which decision he'll make, and more about whether he'll finally understand that he doesn't have to be defined by either world. He can love his family without repeating their mistakes. He can embrace his past without being chained to it. And that's where Hillbilly Elegy delivers its biggest twist, not in a dramatic reveal or a shocking betrayal, but in the quiet realization that strength sometimes looks like showing up. That healing doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it's just a boy sitting beside his broken mother, choosing to stay. And in that moment, choosing himself too. So what lies beneath the surface of Hillbilly Elegy? A story about identity, belonging, and the ties that pull at us long after we've outgrown them. A reflection on how we carry our families with us, even when we run. And perhaps most of all, a reminder that in the space between who we were and who we're becoming, there's room for grace. Whether you come from a small town or a big city, whether your story looks anything like JD's or not at all, this film offers a window into the struggles many families face in silence. It shows how complicated love can be, how relentless addiction is, and how sometimes hope comes not in grand gestures, but in surviving long enough to make a different choice. And that's what makes Hillbilly Elegy a film worth talking about, not just for its performances or its cinematography, but for the questions it leaves behind. What do we owe the people who raised us? Can we forgive what broke us? And how do we hold on to love when it hurts? And through it all, the question lingers. Can you ever really leave the place you came from? Or does it always come with you, whispering in your ear, tugging at your heart, calling you home even when you've worked your whole life to outrun it? As J.D. stands outside the hospital, suit wrinkled, phone in hand, torn between the world of polished ambition and the messy, aching love of his family, we don't know what choice he'll make. But we know this much. He's not just making a decision about a job or a mother. He's deciding who he is, and who he wants to be. And that choice is only beginning. J.D. stands under the glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights, torn between two worlds. Behind him lies the echo of chaos, the endless cycle of relapse and recovery, grief and guilt. Ahead of him waits the life he's worked tirelessly to build, one rooted in order, ambition, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he doesn't have to carry everything with him anymore. The hospital smells like antiseptic and memory. And standing in that space, J.D. begins to see that this trip home isn't just a detour, it's a reckoning. Bev, his mother, is erratic in her hospital bed. She's on the edge of coherence, flipping between charm and fury, need and detachment. She wants help, demands it even, but when J.D. tries to talk through the options, she lashes out. This isn't new. It's a dance they've done 100 times. But what's different now is that J.D. is no longer a boy. He's a man with hard choices to make, and the clock is ticking. He tries to coordinate her release, to find her a facility, to get her somewhere safe. But bureaucracy is slow and compassion is in short supply. Each minute wasted feels like a lifetime unraveling. As he tries to hold things together, the narrative once again folds back into memory. We're brought into a turning point in JD's adolescence, a time when the bottom dropped out completely. Bev, amid one of her darkest spirals, is arrested. The scene is brutal and raw, with young JD watching from the passenger seat of a police cruiser, clutching his knees while his world crumbles. Bev had attempted to steal a prescription pad. She was desperate, not just for the pills, but for some semblance of control. Her mugshot, blank and hollow-eyed, becomes one of the defining images of JD's youth. That night, after the arrest, Mama shows up again. But this time, her usual fire is tempered by something heavier. Weariness, perhaps, or the quiet fear that even her strength might not be enough. Still, she steps in. Again. And this time, she does something different. She doesn't just scold or shelter. She sets a plan in motion. JD moves in with her full-time. He's angry, distant, bruised by betrayal after betrayal. But Mama doesn't let up. She gives him structure, rules, a sense of permanence. He begins to study harder, to push back against the pull of despair. School becomes more than a place to pass time. It becomes his escape route. Slowly, the embers of hope begin to flicker. He starts to believe he might be capable of more than the world around him has shown him. Back in the present, the hours slip by. JD makes desperate calls, bouncing between hospitals, social workers, and treatment centers. No one seems to have the answers he needs. And each unanswered call chips away at the hope he's been clinging to. Meanwhile, his relationship with his girlfriend Usha strains under the weight of the unknown. She tries to be supportive, but from afar, it's hard to understand the emotional landmines he's navigating. She represents safety, future, logic. But home. Home is never that simple. JD checks Bev into a motel. It's not ideal, but it's the only option available. She's calm for a moment, even grateful. She promises to behave, to stay put. But JD knows better than to trust a promise made in that brittle lull between highs. He returns the next morning and, just as he feared, finds chaos. Bev has destroyed the room. She's incoherent, angry, and scared. She accuses him of abandonment. She pleads with him to help her. And in that moment, JD is right back where he started, trapped in the cycle of responsibility and helplessness. Then comes the breaking point. After everything, JD snaps. He leaves. Not out of cruelty, but from exhaustion. 4 years, he's been carrying this weight. And now, with everything on the line, he realizes he has nothing left to give if he loses himself. The scene that follows is quiet, restrained. He sits alone in his car. No tears, no dramatic speech. Just breath. Just stillness. The kind that comes when you finally allow yourself to feel everything all at once. In that silence, memory returns one more time. This time, not with trauma, but with clarity. We're taken back to a scene between JD and Mama not long before her death. She's thinner now, tired, but still sharp. She asks him about his plans. He tells her about the Marines, about how he wants to escape, to break the cycle. Mama doesn't argue. She just nods and tells him she's proud. Then, in a moment of rare softness, she grabs his hand. "You gotta take care of you, honey," she says. "Ain't nobody else gonna do it right." That line sticks. It hangs in the air even after the memory fades. And for the first time, JD begins to understand the truth of it. He returns to his mother, not with answers, but with boundaries. He tells her he'll help, but not by sacrificing himself. He won't enable her. He won't repeat the pattern. She rages, cries, begs. But this time, JD stands firm. It's not an act of defiance. It's an act of survival. Of love, twisted and painful as it may, Beta Film's final moments return us to Yale, where J.D., slightly disheveled but finally clear-eyed, walks into the interview he almost missed. He doesn't lead with his credentials or charm. Instead, he tells his story, where he came from, what he's overcome, who he is. And the power of it lies not in the tragedy, but in the honesty. He doesn't hide the scars. He shows them, because they're proof that he didn't stay broken. We then get a closing sequence, stripped of dialogue, where we see Bev enter rehab, supported not by threats or bribes, but by J.D.'s decision to stop saving her. We see Lindsay with her kids, offering stability in the place where chaos once ruled. And we see J.D. walking through Yale's campus, holding Usha's hand, still carrying his past, but no longer weighed down by it. The credits roll with real photographs of the Vance family. Smiles, moments, memories. Proof that these people lived, loved, hurt, and endured. And in those images, the message becomes clear. Hillbilly Elegy isn't a story about escape. It's a story about return. About confronting the pain you thought you'd buried. About choosing who you want to become, even when the odds are stacked. And about the quiet strength it takes, not to change the people you love, but to love them, even when they don't. Especially when they don't. J.D. never gets a perfect ending. But he gets something better. He gets peace. Not from fixing everything, but from finally knowing where he stands. J.D. Vance doesn't step into the story of Hillbilly Elegy as a man fully formed. He enters carrying scars, some visible, most not, and it's only through peeling back the layers of his past that we begin to understand the quiet storm brewing inside him. He's not a hero in the classical sense, nor is he a passive observer of tragedy. He is something far more familiar, a person torn between where he came from and where he wants to go. This inner conflict is the heartbeat of his character. Stay tuned, because we'll be breaking this one down even further, from character analysis to behind-the-scenes stories, themes, and the impact it had on audiences across the country. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because there's so much more movie magic to explore together. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that speak the loudest. J.D. Vance's story in Hillbilly Elegy begins not in the chaos of a courtroom or on a lecture stage, but on a quiet road, the kind you only find in towns that seem forgotten by time. The air feels heavy with memory, and it's here that the line between the past and the present begins to blur. As J.D., now a Yale law student in his 20s, drives down those familiar winding highways back into the belly of Ohio, he isn't just answering a call from home. He's driving straight into the depths of everything he tried so hard to escape. The call comes suddenly. His sister Lindsay's voice is tired, urgent. Their mother, Bev, is in trouble again. Another relapse. Another emergency. There's a deep breath, a pause that says more than words can. J.D., who is on the cusp of landing a life-changing internship, should be thinking about his future. He's got interviews lined up, connections to make. But family doesn't wait for convenience. Especially not when it's his family. And so, he makes the drive. As the car hums beneath him, the scenery changes, and so does the timeline. The film begins to shift, folding J.D.'s childhood into the fabric of the present. Suddenly, we're not in a law student's world anymore. We're in the scrappy, volatile, confusing childhood of a boy trying to find steady ground in an unsteady life. Young J.D. is all wide eyes and wary footsteps, living under the roof of a mother whose love is real but unpredictable. Bev, once a promising nurse, is losing herself to addiction. Her moods swing like a wrecking ball, laughing one moment, screaming the next, always on the verge of a spiral. We first see young J.D. during one of those unpredictable family dinners, surrounded by raised voices, cigarettes in ashtrays, the tension sharp enough to cut through the mashed potatoes. He's quiet, observant, not because he has nothing to say, but because he knows that sometimes silence is safer. There's a storm in Bev, and it never gives much warning before it hits. Bev, portrayed with searing vulnerability by Amy Adams, isn't a villain. That's what makes her so compelling. She's intelligent, spirited, and genuinely affectionate toward her kids. But she's also volatile and impulsive, slipping into rages and reckless behavior that leave her children emotionally bruised. Her addiction doesn't come in dark alleyways. It comes in prescription bottles, in poorly handled grief, in the spaces where no one's watching. She wants to be better. Sometimes she even tries. But trying isn't enough when the pain inside runs deeper than anyone can see. As Bev's grip on her life loosens, the role of caretaker begins to shift. Young J.D. finds himself juggling school with survival, fending off bullies, protecting his sister, watching his mother unravel. And when things finally fall apart in one heartbreaking scene, it's not the authorities who step in. It's Mama. Glenn Close's Mama arrives not with a hug or a smile, but with a steely glare and a cigarette clenched tight in her fingers. She's not the cuddly grandmother type. She's the kind who tells it like it is, who drives a beat-up old car and wears oversized glasses like armor. But when she shows up at Bev's house after yet another outburst, it's clear, this woman is the real backbone of the family. And though her love isn't always soft, it's unwavering. When Bev is no longer able to care for her son, Mama takes J.D. in. Her home isn't perfect. It's cluttered, chaotic, filled with relics from a long, hard life. But it's the first place he feels something close to safe. Mama doesn't coddle. She teaches J.D. the hard lessons about respect, resilience, and the importance of not letting the world decide who you'll be. She sees something in him, something worth protecting, and she's determined not to let that potential slip away. Back in the present, adult J.D. arrives at the hospital where his mother has been taken. The place is grim, the waiting room stale with fluorescent lighting and the kind of tension only found in emergency rooms. Bev is barely lucid. Her face is a map of exhaustion, pain, and the weight of all her choices. J.D. stands by her bed, not as a boy in need, but as a man trying to make sense of what it means to care for someone who's hurt you. He isn't sure what to do. He isn't sure he can do anything. But he doesn't leave. The dual timeline continues weaving together moments of his youth with scenes of his current crisis. Each memory layers onto the present, coloring his reactions, informing his doubts. When a hotel tells him there's no room, and he finds himself wandering late-night streets with nowhere to stay, it's not just a logistical inconvenience. It's a metaphor for his entire life, always searching for a place that will take him in. We return again to the past, watching a young J.D. struggle in school. He's bright but distracted, pulled under by the chaos of home. He lashes out at teachers, zones out during lessons, and seems ready to tumble down the same path as those around him. But then comes a moment, a simple one, a turning point that could easily go unnoticed. Mama catches him with bad grades and doesn't explode. Instead, she gives him a quiet ultimatum. You have to decide if you're going to be like them or better than them. That line becomes a refrain throughout his life. The idea that choice, even in the face of adversity, matters. It's not an easy choice, not when the odds are stacked against you. But it's a choice nonetheless. And with Mama's stubborn guidance, J.D. starts to choose. He studies. He works hard. He starts to believe, just a little, that maybe he can be more than where he came from. Meanwhile, the adult J.D. struggles to balance the world he's built for himself with the world that raised him. His girlfriend, Usha, calls from Yale, supportive but confused. She represents everything he's worked toward: stability, love, a future unmarred by trauma. But right now, that future feels far away. The past isn't done with him yet. He visits old places, runs into old friends. Every conversation, every familiar face, feels like a pull backward. The town hasn't changed much. It's still filled with people surviving day by day, still echoing with the same pain he knew as a kid. But the difference now is that J.D. sees it differently. Not with judgment, but with clarity. Throughout this stretch of the film, the tension is internal. It's not about whether Bev will recover or whether JD will make his interview on time. It's about whether he'll lose himself in the process. Whether he'll be swallowed whole by the guilt, the anger, the nostalgia, and the impossible weight of family loyalty. The memories keep coming, some sweet, some scarring. And with each one, we understand him more. We see Bev's attempt at recovery, her brief moments of trying to reconnect, her failures, her anger. We see Mama in her bathrobe, offering hard truths and scrambled eggs. We see Lindsay, the sister who grew up too fast, becoming the rock that JD leans on when no one else can stand. And we see JD, caught in the middle of it all, trying to choose between his own survival and the belief that maybe, just maybe, he can help his mother without losing himself. As a boy, JD is observant. He watches the world around him with a caution that feels learned rather than instinctual. Life with Bev teaches him early that stability is fragile, that love can coexist with pain, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to disappear into silence. These early experiences don't harden him, but they do make him guarded. He learns how to read a room, how to stay small, how to find control in the midst of chaos. Yet even in those moments when the weight of his environment threatens to crush him, there's a spark, an ember of curiosity, intelligence, and will that refuses to be snuffed out. As an adult, JD wears the mask of success. Yale Law School, a sharp suit, a poised partner by his side, he looks every bit the man who left his past behind. But it's clear from the start that this is a mask he's still getting used to. The call from his sister shatters that illusion, plunging him back into a world where the past isn't just remembered, it's relived. Each decision he makes, from the moment he picks up that phone, reveals the unresolved tension between duty and distance, between loyalty and self-preservation. His arc isn't about becoming someone new. It's about reconciling who he is with who he was always told he couldn't be. Amy Adams' portrayal of Bev Vance is a study in contradictions. Bev is brilliant, once a promising nurse, capable and quick-witted. But brilliance doesn't insulate her from the demons that haunt her. Addiction, for Bev, is both a symptom and a cage. She's a woman who loves fiercely, who wants desperately to be a good mother, but who is constantly derailed by impulses she can't control. One moment, she's singing along to the radio, full of warmth and laughter. The next, she's screaming, broken by the weight of her own failures. Bev is not an easy character to like, and that's the point. She is not written to be forgiven simply because she suffers. Her choices have consequences, on her children, on herself. But the tragedy of her character is that she knows this. She carries guilt like a second skin, and that guilt fuels her volatility. She lashes out because she's drowning, and like so many caught in addiction, she can't tell the difference between those trying to help her and those trying to control her. Her most painful moments come not in her spirals, but in the calm that follows, the stillness where she looks at her children and knows they're slipping away. JD's sister, Lindsay, doesn't occupy as much screen time, but her presence is a quiet pillar of strength in the narrative. She is, in many ways, the emotional counterpoint to Bev. Where their mother burns hot and erratic, Lindsay steadies. She's the one who keeps the family from falling apart when no one else can. She's the one making the calls, holding things together behind the scenes. Her strength isn't loud. It's in the way she comforts JD without asking for anything. It's in the way she refuses to give up on Bev, even when it hurts. Lindsay's role may seem peripheral, but she embodies the reality of so many caught in the middle of generational trauma, not breaking away entirely, not succumbing, but surviving. She doesn't get the chance to leave like JD does, but she doesn't resent him for it. Instead, she pushes him forward, knowing that his success is their shared hope. Her character is a reminder that survival isn't always about escape. Sometimes it's about enduring, quietly and without recognition. And then there is Mama. Glenn Close's Mama is a force of nature. She storms into the story like a shot of cold air, blunt, unfiltered, and unmistakably real. But beneath the gruff exterior is a heart that beats with absolute, unwavering loyalty. Mama is not soft, but she is steady. Her love is not expressed through words or hugs. It's in the way she slams her fist on the table when JD needs discipline. It's in the way she gives him shelter, demands he study, expects more of him even when the world expects less. Mama's backstory is never fully unpacked, but the pain in her eyes tells us enough. She's lived through hardship, through disappointment, through her own share of mistakes. And in JD, she sees the opportunity to make one thing right. Her relationship with him is one of the most moving in the film, not because of grand gestures, but because of its honesty. She doesn't try to shield him from reality. She teaches him how to survive it. In one scene, Mama watches as young JD wrestles with the chaos of Bev's breakdown. She doesn't promise it will be okay. She doesn't lie to him. Instead, she tells him the truth, that life will be hard, but he gets to choose whether he wants to be strong. That choice, spoken plainly and without sentiment, becomes the defining mantra of his life. Mama is also the film's moral compass. She's flawed, yes. Her temper is explosive, her methods harsh, but she never wavers in her values. She stands up for JD when others write him off. She believes in him, even when he doesn't believe in himself. Her passing leaves a void that JD doesn't know how to fill. But it also gives him something rare, a clear sense of what love looks like when it's given without expectation. Even minor characters in Hillbilly Elegy are drawn with complexity. The townspeople, the teachers, the neighbors, they aren't caricatures of poverty or small-town life. They are people trying their best, some failing, some succeeding. A school counselor sees promise in JD and pushes him to do more. A neighbor offers advice without condescension. These glimpses into the community help paint a fuller picture of the world JD comes from. A world often misunderstood or dismissed by those who've never lived it. And then there's Usha, JD's girlfriend and partner in his new world. She's the calm in his storm, the tether to the life he's building. But her character is more than just supportive. She challenges him, asks questions, demands honesty. She doesn't fully understand the depth of his trauma, but she doesn't dismiss it either. Her presence in the story serves as a mirror, showing JD what stability looks like, what love without volatility can feel like. She is proof that he doesn't have to repeat the past, that another kind of life is possible. Each character in Hillbilly Elegy serves a purpose not just in the plot, but in the emotional architecture of the story. Together, they illustrate a painful, complicated truth, that love and damage often come from the same place. That the people who shape us can both wound and save us. And that healing isn't a straight line, it's a series of choices made in the face of everything trying to pull you back. JD isn't extraordinary because he escapes. He's extraordinary because he returns. Because he faces the pain head-on. Because he chooses to love without surrendering his identity. The real evolution of his character is not in his education or success. It's in the moment he sets a boundary with his mother. In the way he learns to forgive without forgetting. In the strength he finds in remembering where he came from, not as a shameful secret, but as a truth that shaped him. Hillbilly Elegy doesn't offer heroes and villains. It offers people. Real, messy, broken people who fight, fall, hurt each other, and try again. And in doing so, it gives us something far more powerful than fantasy. It gives us reflection. It gives us the reminder that everyone has a story. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is listen. The making of Hillbilly Elegy was a journey full of contrasts, much like the story it tells. From the quiet hills of Kentucky and the working-class neighborhoods of Ohio to the halls of Yale and polished Hollywood sets, the production moved between worlds in more ways than one. But behind the camera, beyond the carefully crafted scenes and powerful performances, something even more fascinating unfolded. A series of unexpected, strange, and deeply human moments that quietly shaped the film into what it ultimately became. It started with the memoir. J.D. Vance's best-selling book, published in 2016, took the literary and political world by storm. Everyone had an opinion about it. Was it a memoir of triumph? A political critique? A sociological exploration of America's forgotten towns? The book was deeply personal to Vance, but it struck a national nerve. So when director Ron Howard signed on to adapt it into a film, he knew he wasn't just making a movie. He was stepping into a conversation, one already tangled with emotion, politics, and perception. And that added a layer of pressure that few projects carry so early on. Ron Howard's choice to direct was itself unusual. Known for classics like Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and Cinderella Man, Howard is no stranger to stories grounded in reality. But Hillbilly Elegy was different. It wasn't about scientists, astronauts, or public figures. It was about broken families, messy kitchens, yelling matches, and people trying to survive. For Howard, that was part of the draw. He reportedly spent months researching Appalachian culture and economic decline, listening to oral histories, and speaking to families in similar circumstances to ensure the portrayal wouldn't slip into caricature. One of the more surprising aspects of production was the transformation of Glenn Close into Mama. When the first photos from the set were released, audiences were stunned. The resemblance to the real-life Mama was uncanny. But what most people didn't know was how deep Glenn went for the role. She spent weeks studying home videos and audio recordings provided by the Vance family. She mimicked not just Mama's voice, but her cadence, her posture, the way she chewed on her cigarette or looked over her glasses. The result was more than a performance. It was a kind of reincarnation. But the strangeness didn't stop there. Glenn Close also wore prosthetic teeth, a padded suit, and specially designed glasses to match Mama's distinct look. The costume team consulted dental specialists and aging experts to replicate features that wouldn't just look realistic on camera, but would feel natural during emotionally intense scenes. Close was so dedicated that, according to crew members, she often stayed in character between takes, walking around set mumbling Mama's sharp observations under her breath, even at craft services. Amy Adams also underwent a remarkable transformation to become Bev. Known for her roles in period dramas, musicals, and high-concept films, Adams stripped away every trace of glamour for this role. She gained weight, let go of vanity, and dove headfirst into the messy, layered world of a woman battling addiction. One strange anecdote from the set reveals just how immersive the process became. During one scene, Adams became so emotionally invested in Bev's outburst that she broke a piece of set furniture. A table meant to be flimsy was shattered with such force it surprised the crew. After the take, everyone stood in silence. No one said, "Cut." They didn't need to. Another lesser-known fact is that the production was intentionally kept small and intimate. Ron Howard wanted the film to feel personal and grounded, so he limited crew size during emotionally heavy scenes. Only essential crew were allowed on set when Adams or Close were performing key monologues or confrontations. This created a kind of quiet sanctity on set, where everyone present was deeply connected to the emotion of the moment. It wasn't about getting the shot, it was about capturing something real. Then there was the strange coincidence surrounding one of the filming locations. A rundown Ohio house used for several flashback scenes had once belonged to a family not unlike the Vances. During scouting, a local resident recognized the house and mentioned that it had seen its own share of hardship. Generations had lived and died there. The production team later discovered that the current owners had faced foreclosure during the financial crisis, mirroring themes in the film. The crew was given permission to shoot inside, but several claimed they experienced odd happenings during filming. Flickering lights, unexplainable temperature drops, and the sound of footsteps when no one else was in the room. Some joked that the house remembered pain. Others simply stayed out of it unless absolutely necessary. Sound design also played a strangely emotional role. Composer David Fleming, who worked on the score under Hans Zimmer's production company, crafted a subtle soundtrack full of echoes, low string hums, and piano notes that never quite resolved. He explained that the goal was to reflect the instability of the characters' lives. Music that sounded like it was trying to find peace but kept circling back into sadness. One piece, titled Memories of Mama, uses actual audio snippets from interviews with Vance's family layered under the strings, barely audible, like ghosts whispering through the score. In post-production, an editor noticed something unusual. In a scene where Mama is watching TV while JD studies at the table, a reflection briefly appears in the glass of a cabinet. It looked like a silhouette, distinctly not a crew member. The team reviewed the footage multiple times, trying to find an explanation. They never did. Ultimately, the moment stayed in the film. Whether it was a trick of the light or something else, no one could say. But it fit the tone of the film so perfectly, this lingering presence of things left unsaid, that no one wanted to remove it. There's also the curious case of the extras. Several of the background characters in town scenes weren't actors at all. They were real residents of Middletown, Ohio. When the production put out a casting call for locals, they were flooded with responses. People wanted to be part of the story, not just because of the fame, but because it felt like their story, too. One woman, cast as a cashier, broke into tears during a rehearsal. She told Amy Adams she'd lived that moment and thanked her for not making the characters look like trash. That moment reportedly left Adams speechless. And then there's the twist that came after filming wrapped. The film's release during the pandemic meant that much of the publicity, promotion, and audience engagement had to happen virtually. This created a disconnect for the cast, many of whom felt the weight of the story deserved in-person reactions. Glenn Close said she didn't get to watch the film with a live audience until months later, and when she did, in a small private screening, the reaction left her shaken. Several viewers cried openly. One man stood and said, "That wasn't a movie. That was my life." Close later said that moment meant more than any award. The film's reception was polarized. Critics were divided. Some praised the performances, others critiqued the narrative's framing. But what many don't know is how deeply the story resonated with viewers outside of Hollywood. In small towns, on message boards, and across social media, people shared their own elegies. Stories of addiction, struggle, generational trauma. J.D. Vance received thousands of messages from viewers who said the film gave them language for what they'd never been able to explain. Some even said they'd shown the film to family members to spark long-overdue conversations. The most unexpected ripple effect? Several addiction recovery centers reported increased inquiries in the months following the film's release. Counselors said that for some, seeing Bev's journey helped them confront their own. For others, it was Mama's no-nonsense love that sparked reflection. And for a handful, it was J.D.'s quiet realization that you don't have to be ashamed of where you come from. In the end, Hillbilly Elegy was more than a film. It became a strange, emotional bridge, connecting audiences who might never have felt seen before. And behind the camera, in hotel rooms, on quiet streets, and in the eyes of the cast and crew, something unfolded that couldn't be planned or rehearsed. A kind of unspoken truth. A reminder that even in fiction, real life lingers just beneath the surface. And sometimes, the strangest parts are the ones that feel the most real. Hillbilly Elegy doesn't demand a grand spectacle. It doesn't sweep across continents or unravel conspiracies. Instead, it settles itself into the ordinary, the personal, the often painful space of memory and inheritance. It tells the story of a boy growing into a man while carrying the weight of generations on his shoulders, and because of that, its critical reception was anything but ordinary. From the moment it premiered, the film became more than just a cinematic adaptation of J.D. Vance's memoir. It became a conversation piece, a mirror, and at times, a lightning rod. Through a critical lens, the film's most significant moments reveal not just its narrative strength or missteps, but the core of its emotional and thematic ambition. One of the earliest and most debated events in the film is the moment when adult J.D. receives the call from his sister Lindsay, telling him their mother Bev has relapsed. This phone call, simple on its surface, becomes a narrative hinge. It not only pulls JD back into the world he has tried to escape, but also confronts the audience with the central tension of the film: family versus self-preservation. Critics were quick to analyze this scene not just as a storytelling device, but as a thematic statement. Is obligation a virtue? Or is it a trap that drags people back into cycles they've worked to escape? That conflict, the pull of the past, colors every choice JD makes from that point forward. And it's in the juxtaposition between present-day JD in the suit and tie and the flashbacks to his younger, wide-eyed self navigating chaos where the film asks its most uncomfortable questions. Critics often landed on one side or the other. Some praised the dual timeline structure, suggesting that it mirrored how trauma rarely stays buried. Others felt it fragmented the story too much, not allowing either timeline the depth it deserved. But regardless of opinion, the structure itself forced viewers to consider how we carry our histories with us, not as distant memories, but as living influences. Another key moment, the one critics returned to again and again, was Bev's arrest. This scene hits with devastating force. She's not foaming at the mouth or acting out in theatrical ways. She's desperate. She's unraveling. She's human. And that's what makes it so painful to watch. The police confrontation is brief, brutal, and final. In a few short minutes, Bev's veneer of control crumbles. The camera doesn't linger on her breakdown. It lingers on young JD's face, watching his mother being taken away. From a critical perspective, this moment embodies one of the film's most powerful choices, showing the collateral damage of addiction without glamorizing or vilifying it. Amy Adams' performance in this scene received significant praise, though it also sparked discussion. Some critics viewed Bev as too mercurial, too sudden in her emotional shifts. Others defended the portrayal, citing it as an honest depiction of the volatility that addiction brings to a family dynamic. But nearly everyone agreed that this scene, this quiet moment of personal collapse, was where the film came closest to transcending its source material and became something uniquely cinematic. Closely tied to this is the arrival of Mama, which critics called one of the film's strongest turns. Glenn Close doesn't walk into her role, she owns it. Her introduction is simple: an argument, a cigarette, a look that could silence an entire room. Yet it is this simplicity that critics latched onto. In Mama, the film found its clearest voice. She is not an angelic matriarch, nor a cruel disciplinarian. She is real, tangled, tough. Her relationship with JD becomes the soul of the story. And the scene where she brings him into her home, laying down rules and expectations, was widely praised for its emotional restraint. No music swell. No dramatic speech. Just two people trying to rebuild something out of the wreckage. From a critical standpoint, Mama represents more than a character. She's the film's moral compass, and perhaps even its thesis. The idea that strength doesn't always come from education or achievement, but from choosing to show up, day after day, for the people you love, even when it's hard. Her methods might be unorthodox, but they're grounded in care. Critics who praised the film often pointed to Mama's scenes as the moments where Hillbilly Elegy found its deepest emotional truth. But the film's handling of socio-economic commentary is where opinions sharply diverged. Some critics argued that the film flattened complex systems into individual anecdotes, risking the suggestion that personal failure is the only barrier to success. Others countered that this was never the film's intent, that Hillbilly Elegy was a personal story, not a political manifesto. JD's journey was never meant to represent every poor Appalachian family, just his own. And in that light, the film's most significant events, his decision to study, his Marine enlistment, his moments of discipline, become markers of individual resilience, not solutions for systemic issues. The climax of the film, emotionally speaking, comes not in a single event, but in JD's moment of refusal. When he tells Bev he won't continue enabling her self-destruction, when he sets a boundary, it's not triumphant. It's heartbreaking. For decades, he has been her anchor, her lifeline, her emotional crutch. Letting go isn't an act of abandonment. It's an act of survival. Critics who connected with the film praised this scene as one of its bravest, because it doesn't offer a clean resolution. It doesn't promise that Bev will get better. It simply shows a son choosing not to drown with her anymore. This choice is echoed in the film's final sequences, when J.D. returns to Yale. He makes it to his interview, not cleaned up, not composed, but real. And this, perhaps more than any other moment, divides opinion. Some saw it as a classic Hollywood resolution, an unnecessary reassurance that everything would work out. Others saw it as the quiet victory that J.D. had been fighting for all along. Not the job, but the self-respect. Some saw it as a classic Hollywood resolution, an unnecessary reassurance that everything would work out. Others saw it as the quiet victory that J.D. had been fighting for all along. Not the job, but the self-respect. The belief that he didn't have to carry his family's burdens into every room he entered. From a thematic perspective, this moment completes the arc. J.D. doesn't reject his past. He embraces it, but on his terms. He walks into that interview not as a man escaping his origins, but as someone shaped by them. And in that, the film delivers its core message, that we are not defined by the worst things we've lived through, but by how we choose to move forward. The emotional resonance of these moments is what lingered for many viewers. Critics acknowledged that Hillbilly Elegy wasn't universally relatable in setting, but it was universally human in emotion. The heartbreak of watching a parent spiral. The complicated loyalty to someone who's hurt you. The desire to be more than what you were told you'd become. These are the threads that run through every major event in the film, and they are what give it weight, especially in the quiet, unspoken moments. One scene often overlooked in initial reviews, but celebrated in later analysis, is the montage of Mama's final days. There are no long speeches, no grand goodbyes. Just small gestures, a bowl of soup, a shared glance, a trembling hand resting on J.D.'s arm. These details, small but potent, speak louder than dialogue ever could. Critics later returned to this moment as the emotional anchor of the film, where love was expressed not through words, but through presence. Ultimately, the film's reception was shaped as much by expectation as execution. Some approached it looking for a social critique and were disappointed. Others found in it a story that resonated with their own lives and backgrounds. But through every critical lens, the film's most significant events stood as testament to its intention, to tell a deeply personal story about survival, love, and the complicated beauty of family. And whether praised or picked apart, Hillbilly Elegy succeeded in one undeniable way: it made people feel. It made them remember. It made them talk. And that, in the end, is what stories are for. The creation of Hillbilly Elegy was never meant to be just another film shoot. From the moment Ron Howard stepped on board as director, there was a clear sense that this project would demand something more intimate, more grounded than the average studio production. It was going to require a commitment not only to the craft but to the truth. And not just the truth as written in J.D. Vance's memoir, but the emotional truth buried in the messy, painful, and often overlooked corners of a real American family's life. The first step in that process was location. The Vance family story spanned decades and two very different places: Middletown, Ohio, and the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. The production team quickly realized that to capture the essence of these places, they couldn't rely solely on studio sets or digital backdrops. They had to go to the heart of it. They scouted locations across Ohio and Georgia, where much of the filming eventually took place, seeking neighborhoods, backroads, diners, and homes that still carried the weight of history in their walls and streets. One of the most important settings was Mama's house. The production team was meticulous in designing it. They filled it with mismatched furniture, old calendars, half-finished puzzles, and family photos that looked like they'd been hanging since the 1970s. Every detail was intentional. They even left drawers half open, filled with old receipts and trinkets, just in case the actors wanted to interact with their surroundings. Glenn Close, in particular, would often open a drawer and comment, in character, on something she found. It wasn't scripted, It was real improvisation grounded in a physical space that felt lived in. The atmosphere on set reflected this same attention to detail. Ron Howard, known for his calm and collaborative directing style, encouraged an environment where actors could immerse themselves in their roles without feeling rushed. Amy Adams and Glenn Close were often seen rehearsing quietly in corners, working through emotional beats in their scenes not with grand gestures, but with small, precise shifts in expression and posture. Howard would sometimes delay a take simply because he sensed the actor needed a breath, needed to let the moment rise naturally. That patience led to performances that felt honest and raw. Behind the scenes, the cast and crew bonded quickly. The subject matter was heavy, but the people making the film were anything but solemn. Between takes, Amy Adams was known for cracking jokes and keeping the mood light. Glenn Close brought her dog to set, a tiny terrier who often sat beside the monitor during takes. The crew gave him a makeshift director's chair with Mama Jr. stitched on the back. One particularly touching moment happened during the filming of a tense argument scene between Bev and JD. Amy Adams had thrown herself so fully into the role that after the scene wrapped, she stayed seated in the corner, quietly weeping. Gabriel Basso, who played the adult JD, didn't say anything. He simply walked over and sat beside her, both of them silent, their shoulders touching. No one dared to interrupt. That unspoken connection between the actors mirrored the complicated relationship they portrayed on screen. Costume and makeup departments also worked miracles in bringing these characters to life. Glenn Close's transformation into Mama was one of the most talked about elements of the production. It wasn't just the prosthetics or the wig or the oversized glasses, it was the way she moved, spoke, and carried herself. She studied hours of home videos provided by the Vance family, mimicking Mama's gait and even the way she held her cigarettes. The result was so convincing that some of the real family members were reportedly moved to tears when they first saw her in full costume. Amy Adams, too, underwent a drastic shift. Her usually polished appearance was replaced by worn clothes, greasy hair, and pale, drawn features. She met with addiction counselors and individuals who had struggled with opioids to better understand the physical and emotional toll of addiction. Her performance was shaped not just by research, but by compassion. She wanted Bev to feel real, not as a villain or a victim, but as a complicated woman fighting her own war. Production design extended even to the smallest props. The family photos seen throughout the film were carefully curated from a mix of real images and posed recreations. In some cases, crew members' families were used to fill in the backgrounds of framed photos. One assistant set decorator joked that her cousin is now forever immortalized as Mama's fake nephew. The team also sourced actual furniture from thrift stores and estate sales in Ohio, preferring authenticity over convenience. Every scratch, stain, and faded fabric thread added depth to the world. Another layer of depth came from the film's musical score. Composer David Fleming crafted a soundscape that was minimal but emotionally charged. He used soft piano lines and ambient textures to reflect the inner turmoil of the characters. Interestingly, some of the most powerful scenes in the film are completely devoid of music. The film's editing process also revealed unique insights into the rhythm of memory. Editor James Wilcox worked closely with Howard to find a structure that didn't just flash back for the sake of exposition, but that mirrored the emotional logic of JD's journey. They often chose to cut to the past not because it answered a plot question, but because it paralleled the emotional weight of the present. For example, when adult JD stands alone in a motel room, the film cuts to a young JD waiting on a front porch, two moments of helplessness separated by decades but united by feeling. An unexpected challenge during production was recreating the passage of time across the decades. Hair, makeup, and set dressing had to subtly reflect shifts in style and technology. The team used everything from vintage soda cans to era-appropriate car models to ground each scene in its proper time. At one point, the art department tracked down a nearly mint-condition copy of a Time magazine issue from 1997 just to use in a 2-second background shot. These touches, while often unnoticed by viewers, helped the actors feel grounded in the world they were inhabiting. One fun, lesser-known fact? The scene where Mama throws her TV out the window, a fan-favorite moment full of rage and righteous indignation, was only supposed to be rehearsed that day. But Close was so in character that when the rehearsal began, she picked up the TV, shouted her line, and actually flung it through the glass. The crew wasn't prepared. The cameras were barely rolling. But the energy was electric. Ron Howard quickly adjusted, asked everyone to reset, and they captured the scene again, this time for real. Close's spontaneity gave the moment a rawness that couldn't have been manufactured. The release of the film, coming during the COVID-19 pandemic, meant that much of its promotion and reception unfolded online. Cast interviews were conducted via video calls, red carpet events were scaled down or virtual, and screenings were limited. Yet despite these constraints, the film found its audience. It sparked conversations, not just about addiction or rural poverty, but about family, memory, and the challenge of representing real-life people on screen. One of the most poignant behind-the-scenes stories came during a private screening for J.D. Vance and his family. As the lights dimmed and the first scenes rolled, there was a hush in the room. When Mama appeared, portrayed so fully and fearlessly by Glenn Close, several members of the family reportedly wept. For them, this wasn't just a movie. It was a reunion, a reminder, a tribute. Hillbilly Elegy may have had its critics, but behind the scenes, it was a film made with an uncommon level of care, commitment, and emotional truth. It wasn't about getting everything perfect. It was about honoring the messiness of real life. And in that mess, in the tension between pain and love, despair and resilience, the cast and crew found something worth capturing. It was more than just lights, camera, action. It was heart. And every beat of it can still be felt long after the credits fade to black. In Hillbilly Elegy, the settings aren't just backdrops, they're characters. Every location is layered with memory, tension, and emotional complexity, and the film's ability to move fluidly between past and present is guided not just by performance or plot, but by place. From the cramped houses in Middletown, Ohio, to the green Appalachian hills of Jackson, Kentucky, the story unfolds across spaces that echo with history and hardship. Director Ron Howard and cinematographer Maurice Alberti understood this intimately. Together, they crafted a visual narrative that makes the settings feel alive, weathered, raw, and hauntingly familiar. The film opens with a drive. That single, simple movement, a car traveling along an open road, immediately roots us in J.D. Vance's dual reality. On one side of the windshield lies his present, Yale Law School, polished cities, ambition. On the other, a return to the place he left behind. As the landscape blurs by, the viewer is pulled not just across miles but through time. This movement becomes a motif throughout the film. The idea of return. The tension of place. The roads are long, and they're not just taking J.D. somewhere. They're pulling him back into everything he tried to leave behind. One of the most impactful settings is Middletown itself, a once thriving industrial town slowly unraveling under the weight of economic decline. The houses are modest, many of them in varying states of decay. Yards are cluttered. The sidewalks are cracked. But there's also color here, and warmth. The choice to shoot many of these scenes on location or in meticulously recreated sets allowed the film to capture the texture of real life. There's no Hollywood gloss in these neighborhoods. The paint peels, the carpets are stained, the appliances hum with a low whine. These spaces feel lived in. And in that authenticity, there's an emotional pull that grounds the story in truth. Inside these homes, the lighting is often dim, with warm tones that suggest both comfort and claustrophobia. J.D.'s childhood house is narrow and chaotic. There are photographs on the walls, toys in corners, but there's also a sense of instability. The rooms feel too small, too loud. The camera often frames characters in tight shots, using the space to amplify tension. In moments of domestic crisis, Bev's outbursts, J.D.'s panic, the setting doesn't just reflect their emotions. It intensifies them. You feel the walls closing in. You feel the pressure. Mama's house, in contrast, is a strange mix of order and decay. It's a relic, stuck in time, with furniture from decades past and a TV always flickering in the corner. But it's also where J.D. begins to feel a sliver of stability. The cinematography shifts subtly here. There's more stillness, more wide shots. The lighting is natural, often filtering through sheer curtains in golden beams. There's dust in the air, but there's also peace. The house becomes a sanctuary, not because it's perfect, but because it represents consistency in a world that keeps falling apart. The Appalachian setting of Jackson, Kentucky, where the Vance family roots lie, adds another layer to the film's emotional texture. The hills are lush, the air thick with green and gold. But this isn't the romanticized South. It's a land of hard labor and deep ties. In flashback scenes, we see family gatherings, hunting trips, and roadside confrontations that feel both specific and symbolic. The camera lingers on landscapes, rolling hills, creeks, rusting signs. These images aren't filler. They're memory. They serve as emotional markers, grounding J.D.'s identity in a place that shaped him long before he understood how. One of the most powerful scenes, Bev's hospital breakdown, was also one of the most challenging. Amy Adams had to tap into a terrifying emotional depth, screaming and breaking down in front of Gabriel Basso, who plays the adult J.D. The hospital room, designed with sterile lighting and minimal distractions, added to the pressure. The first take was so intense that the crew stood still even after Ron Howard called cut. Nobody wanted to move. They were afraid they'd break the spell. Amy sat in her chair, breathing heavily, eyes still brimming. Gabriel didn't speak. He just reached over and gave her a quiet nod. No need for words. Gabriel himself was a revelation. Having built his career slowly, carefully, this was his first time headlining a major dramatic film. On set, he was quiet, thoughtful, and observant, much like J.D. in the film. He was known for taking long walks between takes, often looping around the lot while listening to music. It was part of his process. Cast and crew started calling these walks Gabe laps, and sometimes Ron Howard would joke, "Somebody find out how many laps it takes to become a lawyer." But there were light-hearted moments too, especially on the days filming scenes from J.D.'s childhood. Young actor Owen Astellos, who played teenage J.D., brought an energy that lifted everyone. He had a habit of imitating crew members in between takes, especially Ron Howard. One day, with a backwards baseball cap and a director's chair, he mimicked Ron's voice perfectly, shouting, "Let's go again with a little more pain in the eyebrows." Ron was so amused he let Owen sit in the director's chair for an entire setup. And then there was Glenn Close, fearless, meticulous, and endlessly prepared. Her transformation into Mama wasn't just physical, though the makeup team did incredible work with prosthetics, wigs, and wardrobe. It was her voice, her posture, her stare. Crew members would whisper to each other, "She's not acting, she is Mama." Glenn stayed in character for much of the shoot, but she wasn't method in a way that distanced her. She'd snap back to herself quickly, offer feedback, or comfort a crew member having a rough day. One day, during a scene where Mama and J.D. argue in the kitchen, the tension ran so high that a crew member dropped a boom mic from the ceiling, not from clumsiness, but because their hands were shaking. Glenn turned to them after the take and said, "It's okay, baby. Mama wouldn't mind. She'd probably throw the mic back at you anyway." Ron Howard, known for his steady leadership, kept the shoot focused and humane. He believed in keeping egos off set and humanity front and center. He made a point to learn the names of every crew member, from lighting techs to drivers. On cold nights, he'd bring blankets and coffee to extras. He encouraged suggestions from anyone. If a grip had an idea about blocking, Ron would listen. It created a rare energy, a team that felt ownership of the story, not just responsibility to it. The production also faced its fair share of challenges. Weather was unpredictable. Many scenes were shot in Georgia, doubling for Ohio and Kentucky, and sudden rainstorms would delay outdoor shoots. One day, while filming a flashback of JD as a kid walking home from school, lightning shut down the entire production. The crew huddled under tents, soaked and waiting, when Glenn Close pulled out her phone and started reading old Mama-style jokes she had collected. Her deadpan delivery turned a cold, miserable delay into a memory people still talk about. Another hurdle was finding the right balance in the film's timeline. Because the narrative moves between past and present, production had to be incredibly organized to avoid confusion. Scenes were not shot in chronological order. One day Gabriel Basso would be dealing with adult JD's emotional confrontation with Bev, and the next, Owen Astelos would be running from a neighbor's barking dog as young JD. Filming emotionally raw scenes back-to-back with such temporal distance in the story required constant coordination and trust. Trust that the vision would hold, that the pieces would fit. They did more than fit. There were also small acts of kindness that quietly shaped the shoot. The costume department kept photos of the real Vance family on a corkboard in their trailer for reference, and every morning, before fittings, they'd glance at those faces. Not because they needed to replicate every outfit exactly, but to remind themselves, these are real people. Their lives mattered. Their dignity mattered. At lunch, the crew would often eat together, not in separate cliques, but side by side. On Sundays, some would host cookouts in the parking lot. Families visited. Kids played tag among the trailers. Despite the heavy content, there was levity in the off hours. There had to be. It kept the humanity intact when production wrapped. The last scene filmed was a quiet one. JD sitting on Mama's porch, watching the sunset. The sky was perfect, burning orange and soft purple clouds. As the final take finished, there was no cheering, no big announcement. Just a long silence. Ron Howard stood up, nodded, and said, "That's a wrap." Then, one by one, crew members started applauding, not with wild claps, but with soft, steady rhythm. It wasn't the end of a job. It was the closing of something intimate, something personal. And maybe that's what made the behind-the-scenes story of Hillbilly Elegy so special. It was more than filmmaking. It was a family, flawed, funny, focused, coming together to tell the story of another. And every scene, every tear, every moment on and off camera, it came from a place of love. In Hillbilly Elegy, the story unfolds not with a grand gesture or sweeping epics but through quiet struggles and small, personal revolutions. Its emotional power is anchored not in the extraordinary, but in the everyday. Beneath the realism of its characters, its towns, and its unraveling family dynamics lies a rich landscape of themes and symbolism, subtle but deeply embedded in every choice the filmmakers made. This isn't just a story about one man's journey. It's a layered reflection on identity, inheritance, pain, and the long, hard road toward healing. At its heart, the film is about the pull between two worlds, past and future, chaos and order, survival and ambition. J.D. Vance exists on the threshold between where he came from and where he hopes to go. This tension forms the foundation of the film's central theme, the complexity of family loyalty. Every major decision J.D. makes is weighed against this invisible ledger of love and responsibility. The film never offers easy answers. It doesn't ask whether he should abandon his family or save them. Instead, it asks what it means to carry love for people who sometimes cause you harm. What does it mean to owe yourself a better life when the people who raised you are still stuck in their pain? The symbol that represents this most clearly is the home. Not just a singular house, but every physical space that represents family. J.D.'s childhood house is small, cramped, and bursting with noise. The walls have seen fights, laughter, broken promises, and brief, beautiful moments of connection. It's in these homes that J.D. learns who he is, not through lectures, but through experience. The shifting settings, the hospital, the motel, Mama's home, Yale's campus, aren't just locations. They symbolize his internal conflict, each one tugging him in a different direction. The film's cinematography is deeply intentional in how it manipulates perspective. Past scenes are often shot with a slightly grainier texture, giving them the feel of faded photographs or home video. Present-day scenes, particularly those set at Yale or on the road, are sharper, colder. The color grading plays a key role in this shift. The past is warm, sometimes overwhelmingly so. Yellows and browns dominate, adding to the sense of heat, closeness, suffocation. The present is cooler, washed in blues and grays. This contrast visually represents JD's internal conflict, the emotional heat of home versus the calculated clarity of his future. Lighting is used masterfully to emphasize character states. During Bev's breakdowns, the lighting shifts dramatically. Harsh backlight, flickering fluorescence, shadows that stretch across rooms. These choices create a disorienting effect, mirroring the emotional chaos she's spiraling through. In contrast, scenes with Mama tend to favor softer lighting. Even during moments of confrontation, there's a golden hue that seems to wrap around her like armor. It suggests wisdom, age, and a quiet strength that doesn't need theatrics to be felt. One of the film's most visually poetic scenes is when young JD sits on Mama's porch as the sun sets. The light is low, casting long shadows. You can hear the hum of cicadas, the rustle of trees. Nothing dramatic happens. But in that stillness, something sacred is captured. A moment of peace. A pause in the noise. Critics noted that this scene, though brief, encapsulates the entire emotional arc of the film. What it means to be still, to remember, to be held by a place that once hurt you. Another noteworthy cinematic element is the film's use of mirrors and reflections. In several scenes, characters are shown through cracked mirrors or reflected in windows. These visuals serve as subtle commentary on fractured identity. JD sees himself through multiple lenses, child of trauma, student of privilege, bridge between two worlds. The mirrors reinforce that tension, showing how easily the image can split. There's one moment where adult JD stares at himself in a motel mirror, unsure of who he's becoming. The lighting is stark, the frame tight. You can see the strain on his face. The mirror doesn't offer answers, just another version of the same question. Sound design also plays a crucial role in building atmosphere. The soundtrack is understated, favoring ambient tones and gentle piano melodies. But it's the silence that often says the most. In scenes of confrontation, the sound drops. No background music, no distractions. Just breathing, footsteps, the creak of a chair. This minimalist approach heightens the emotional stakes, forcing the audience to sit with the discomfort rather than being guided out of it. One scene that masterfully blends setting, sound, and performance is Bev's hospital breakdown. The hospital is sterile, fluorescent, and eerily quiet. As she lashes out, screaming, crying, the clinical backdrop never changes. There's no swelling music, no dramatic camera swoop. Just the raw contrast between her internal storm and the cold indifference of the setting. It's this dissonance that makes the scene so unsettling, and so real. Even the Yale settings, though brief, are used with precision. The architecture is imposing, the halls echo with privilege. JD is framed in wide shots, dwarfed by his surroundings. These visual choices reinforce his sense of displacement. He's earned his place there, but he hasn't yet found how to belong. The contrast between Yale's grandeur and Middletown's worn-down homes isn't just visual, it's thematic. It represents the chasm JD must navigate, not just between places, but between versions of himself. Throughout the film, transitions between settings are rarely abrupt. Instead, they blend. A door closing in the present echoes a door slamming in the past. The sound of tires on gravel overlaps between timelines. These cinematic bridges remind us that JD's story isn't told in neat chapters. It's layered, overlapping, always bleeding through. One of the most emotional settings, both visually and narratively, is Mama's living room in her final days. The lighting is low, everything is still. The room is cluttered with life. Photographs, books, snacks, the remains of 1,000 family moments. JD sits beside her. He doesn't speak. He just holds her hand. The setting does the talking. It says, "This is where you were made." It says, "This is what matters." By the time the film ends and JD walks back into the world he chose, the world of Yale, ambition, and opportunity, the memory of those places lingers. The homes, the roads, the porch, the hospital. They don't vanish. They follow. And that's the final gift the film's settings give us: permanence. Proof that even if we leave, even if we change, the places that shaped us never truly disappear. They become part of us, and in Hillbilly Elegy, those places are painted with such care, such grit and grace, that they live far beyond the frame. Behind every frame of Hillbilly Elegy, beneath the raw emotion and carefully composed scenes, there lived a world of quiet collaboration, unexpected humor, and a crew that poured heart and grit into telling a deeply personal story. While the film presents a tale of broken homes, addiction, survival, and family, the atmosphere on set was anything but heavy all the time. In fact, it was the balance of those intense emotional moments with warmth, laughter, and mutual support that allowed the cast and crew to go as deep as they did. What happened behind the camera was often just as rich and layered as what ended up on screen. The story began to take shape long before cameras rolled. When Ron Howard took the director's chair, he approached Hillbilly Elegy not just as a filmmaker, but as a student of the world J.D. Vance described in his memoir. He and his team spent months absorbing every detail of the real Vance family's history, walking through Middletown, Ohio, speaking to locals, and listening to the voices of people who lived through similar struggles. The goal wasn't to imitate, it was to understand. And that tone of respect filtered through every layer of the production. One of the earliest decisions that shaped the tone of the shoot was casting. Glenn Close and Amy Adams are both powerhouses, legends in their own right, but they brought zero ego to the set. From day one, they set a tone of humility and openness that trickled down to every crew member. According to some production assistants, Glenn would sit and chat with makeup artists during breaks, asking about their families or what projects they were excited about. Amy, who plays Bev, was known for her warmth and her habit of easing tension during long days by telling hilarious, self-deprecating stories about her early days in Hollywood. But once the cameras rolled, the atmosphere shifted. These actresses would transform. One moment Amy was joking about coffee, and the next she was Bev, vulnerable, unhinged, raw. The crew quickly learned to give her space after intense scenes. They didn't call cut with fanfare. They let the emotion settle, respected the silence, and moved gently. It became part of the rhythm of the shoot. Mama's house, in particular, serves as a powerful metaphor. On the surface, it's just another modest, cluttered space. But to J.D., it becomes a sanctuary, a fortress against the chaos that Bev's spiraling often creates. The house is filled with aging furniture, old photographs, and Mama's stubborn routines. It doesn't change. It doesn't falter. And in that consistency, it becomes a symbol of tough love, of values that may not be gentle but are deeply rooted in survival. The film doesn't glorify poverty or suffering, but it does honor resilience. Mama's house, with its quiet corners and firm boundaries, becomes the physical embodiment of that resilience. Closely linked to this is the theme of intergenerational trauma. Bev's struggles with addiction are not presented as isolated or sudden. Instead, they're shown as the latest chapter in a long, difficult story. The anger, volatility, and fear that Bev lives with didn't begin with her. It was passed down, perhaps unspoken, from the world that raised her. The film never fully explains what Bev endured, but it gives us enough to understand that her pain didn't come from nowhere. Mama's tough love was forged in hardship. Bev's instability, in turn, reflects a reaction to that toughness. And J.D. must decide which parts of that legacy he will carry forward, and which he will finally let go. In this, choice becomes another crucial theme. Again and again, the characters are faced with moments that demand a decision. Mama asks JD to choose whether he'll become someone who fights for something better. Lindsay chooses to stay, to care for Bev even when it hurts. And JD, in the film's quietest climax, chooses to love his mother without losing himself. These choices aren't cinematic in the traditional sense. They don't come with fanfare or victory. They come with exhaustion, hesitation, and sometimes guilt. But they matter. The film argues that healing begins not with one big leap, but with 100 small decisions to be different. Another deeply embedded theme is identity and belonging. JD exists in two worlds, the Appalachian roots of his family and the elite academic environment of Yale Law School. These spaces are not just different, they often seem irreconcilable. In one of the film's most poignant scenes, JD stands in a Yale bathroom, surrounded by polished marble and unfamiliar etiquette, unable to choose the correct fork at a formal dinner. It's a small moment, but loaded with meaning. The scene isn't about cutlery, it's about the quiet alienation that comes from social mobility. What do you lose when you try to rise? What part of yourself must you hide to be accepted? This idea is echoed visually through reflections. Mirrors, windows, and glass surfaces appear repeatedly throughout the film. They show characters at a distance, fractured, or in profile. In one scene, JD stares at himself in a motel mirror, searching for the man he's trying to become. The symbolism is clear. He's not whole yet. His reflection doesn't reassure him. It questions him. Who is he if he doesn't go home? Who is he if he does? The mirror becomes a symbol of liminality, of existing in between. Addiction and forgiveness also take center stage. Bev's arc is devastating because it's rooted in realism. She doesn't suddenly get better. She doesn't have a breakthrough moment where everything changes. Her addiction isn't a villain, it's a sickness, a symptom of deeper pain. The film doesn't ask the audience to excuse her behavior. Instead, it asks them to see it, to witness her complexity. And in doing so, it shows the audience how forgiveness, too, is a choice. Not a pardon, but a path. JD doesn't forgive Bev in one scene. He does it over and over again, sometimes in anger, sometimes in love, always with hesitation. That ongoing process is what makes it honest. Symbolism is also found in movement. JD is almost always traveling in the film, by car, on foot, between rooms, between timelines. This physical movement parallels his emotional journey. He's never still for long. He's always caught in transit, between past and present, between pain and progress. The roads he drives on become a metaphor for his uncertainty. They wind. They double back. They stretch far into the distance. And yet, he keeps driving. Even time itself becomes symbolic. The film moves back and forth between childhood and adulthood, between memories and real-time decisions. This non-linear approach mirrors how trauma lives in the body. It doesn't fade with age. It waits. It returns when you least expect it. JD isn't just remembering. He's reliving. Each flashback is triggered by something in the present, and each one shapes how he moves forward. The structure of the film becomes a mirror of the healing process. Disjointed, painful, and non-sequential. Mama's character carries the most concentrated symbolism. She's rough-edged, profane, and unapologetically herself. But beneath that shell is a deep wisdom, one forged in fire. Her love is symbolized by small acts, a bowl of cereal left out, a quiet nod, a steady presence. She represents the paradox of tough love, the idea that care doesn't always come with softness. Her home becomes a shrine to survival. Her death, a turning point not just in the story, but in JD's sense of responsibility. Without her, the weight of the family falls to him. And he's not sure he's ready to carry it. The theme of perception versus reality also plays quietly in the background. Early in the film, JD is judged at Yale for where he comes from. He doesn't know how to speak the language of the elite. He's seen as lesser. But back home, he's seen as a traitor for leaving. No matter where he goes, he doesn't quite fit. This tension speaks to the experience of many who grow up in poverty and rise into new social classes. The film doesn't romanticize either world. It simply shows how hard it is to belong to both. Ultimately, Hillbilly Elegy is about emotional inheritance. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about where we come from, and how those stories shape the choices we make. It's about the patterns we repeat, the pain we carry, and the ways we try to love each other even when it's hard. The film doesn't offer clean resolutions. It offers glimpses. Glimpses of grace, of strength, of broken people trying to hold on to each other in a world that keeps shifting beneath their feet. Every setting, every flashback, every line of dialogue is laced with meaning. The themes aren't shouted, they're whispered through images, decisions, and moments of stillness. And in those quiet, symbolic beats, the film finds its power. Because Hillbilly Elegy isn't just about J.D. Vance. It's about all of us. About the families we love, the pain we inherit, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, we can choose to do it differently. Filmmaking, at its most powerful, is about more than just telling a story. It's about how that story is told. In Hillbilly Elegy, that how is crucial. Because the film is grounded in the intimate, the ordinary, and the often painful truths of a real family, the techniques behind the camera had to mirror that honesty. From the very first frame, director Ron Howard, cinematographer Maurice Alberti, editor James Wilcox, and the rest of the creative team made deliberate, emotionally driven choices that allowed the story to breathe and feel lived in. Their focus wasn't to dazzle or overwhelm, it was to listen, to observe, and to make the audience feel like they were stepping directly into someone else's memory.